So right now we're going into sociology from a macro and micro lens perspective. So I just wanted to briefly, review what sociology is, which is the study of society, human social interaction, and the rules and processes that bind and separate people, not only as individuals, but as members of associations, groups, and institutions. And many researchers in that field like to investigate these processes by a macro sociology perspective and a micro sociology perspective. So for macro sociology, that focuses on the large scale perspective, looking at big phenomena that affect a big portion of the population, and also how this picture affects small groups. So some examples are looking at social structures, institutions, whole civilizations and populations, and more that I have here on the slide. And on the other hand, they also look at it on a micro sociology perspective, focusing on the smaller scale perspective, looking at face-to-face interactions and how individual interactions would affect larger groups. So some examples of this are doctor-patient interactions, interactions within families, schools, and others similar to that. And so the first theory that is part of the macro sociology perspective is functionalism. And functionalism was developed by this man here, Emil. I'm not sure if I'm completely pronouncing that right, but his last name is Durkheim. And he looks at society as a whole and how institutions keep the society stable and functioning. And so he has several terms that he uses to define that are associated with his theory. And the way he defines institutions are structures that meet the needs of society. So examples he gives are education systems, financial institutions, marriage, laws, and more like that. And these institutions can have two functions, which are either manifest functions, which are the intended consequences of institutions, and also latent functions, which are the unintended consequences of institutions. He also uses the term social facts, which are ways of thinking and acting formed by society that existed before any one individual existed, and also still will exist after any individual has passed away. So he considers these as unique objects that can't be influenced and also have a coercive effect over individuals that are only noticed once people resist. So the example he uses is the law. And then he also defines social dysfunction as a process that has an undesirable consequence and may reduce stability of the society. Another common term that's associated with functionalism particularly is social anomie, which is that the alienation that an individual feels when social norms and social bonds are weak. So he hypothesizes that without attachment to society, people will experience purposelessness and aimlessness, which is the social anomie feeling. Durkheim also postulated that small societies are held together by similarities, but this idea only works for small societies. On the other hand, he believed large societies become interdependent on one another as they specialize in different roles, which allows them to have a stable society. But one of the problems with functionalism that other theorists criticized Durkheim for was that it doesn't really focus on the individual perspective and also doesn't look at how conflicts can affect society. So this leads us to the conflict theory, which was developed by Marx, and it was the idea that society is made of institutions that are powerful, which creates inequalities. And he believed society evolves from feudalism to capitalism and finally to socialism. And the example that Marx points to when talking about capitalism happens to be 19th century Europe, which was broken down into the bourgeois class, which is the rich upper class, a minority of the population at that time, and the proletariat, which were considered the poor lower class, which was the majority of the population. And he believed that it was through class consciousness which led to people, noticing these inequalities. So them being aware of their place in a system of social classes, created that class struggle and that conflict between these classes. He also used the term thesis, which was considered the generally accepted existing state of society, and antithesis, which is the reaction and opposition to the thesis, which usually happens by the working class. And he also used the term synthesis, which was a compromise between both the thesis and the antithesis. Here we also have Max Weber, who contributed a little bit also to the conflict theory, but he also argued that several factors were moderating people's reactions to inequality. So some of these things that he mentioned were class status and power. So like how people actually reacted to this inequality were dependent on these different points. And one of the problems with conflict theory that other theorists criticized him about was the fact that it doesn't really focus on like the stability of the society, which I guess looking back is now why we have functionalism looking at that other side. Next, also part of macro sociology is the feminist theory, which focuses on pointing out the stratifications or inequalities due to institutions of society for women. And, this is through analyzing the social roles and experiences that women face in education, in family roles, and their workforce. And this was a theory that actually originated from conflict theory. So within the feminist theory, there are different focuses that it would be like subgroups of the feminist group focus on. So some of them focus on gender differences, which gender differences are socially constructed and they are created via processes of socialization. It's hypothesized that society creates and passes down norms, customs, and expectations for gender from generation to generation. The other aspect that has another focus is gender inequality, which is central to all behavior and organizations in society. It's also usually seen as under a patriarchal society where women's subordination is viewed as an inherent feature. And so here I define patriarchy, where it's when men constitute the governing body as heads of families and communities. The other focus is gender oppression, where it's found that women are not only unequal as men, but they're also oppressed, subordinated, and abused. And then there's also structural oppression, which is when women's oppression and inequality are due to capitalism, the patriarchy, and racism. And the last macro sociology theory is social constructionism, which is when people actively shape their reality through social interactions and agreement. It's something constructed but not inherent, and it was developed by Berger and Luckman. So they believe that, there was a social construct, which is the concept or practice that everyone in society agrees to treat something a certain way, regardless of its inherent value. So the example they give is money, which, without the value that society gives money, it's kind of just a piece of paper. And so like without that value, then money would be thought as useless in maybe another society. And then he also defines self as our identity being created by interactions with other people, and also created by our reactions to other people and society. And he also defined a difference between weak social constructionism and strong social constructionism. So they proposed that social constructs are dependent on brute facts, So those are most fundamental facts and also institutional facts, which are created by social conventions that rely on other facts. So like the example with money, it depends on the value that we give this piece of paper. And this was contrasted with strong social constructionism, which is when the whole of reality is dependent on language and social habits, and all knowledge is a social construct, and there are no brute facts. I guess one criticism towards this theory was that social constructionism doesn't quite address the natural phenomena that would probably be seen through like these brute facts. But because, for that strong social constructionism, it's not dependent on brute facts. That's why that was one of the criticism for this theory. And now we go into microsociology. So a theory that is common on the MCAT is symbolic interactionism, which is when it examines small-scale social interactions, focusing the attention on how shared meaning is established among individuals or small groups. This was developed by George Herbert Mead, and he talked about subjective meanings, which are when humans ascribe meanings to things, and also each individual acts towards those things based on that original ascribed meaning. He also defined language as allowing humans to generate meaning through interactions, and also allowing humans to modify their meanings through to their thought processes. He was particularly interested in looking at symbols that are used by people and how they also contribute their values and beliefs to others through these different symbols. But he also noted that as time goes on, our meanings can also change based on our interactions with others. So that's that. And then the final microsociology theory for today is the rational choice or exchange theory. So the rational choice theory postulates that people are not only motivated by money, but they also do what's best to get the better value in a sense. So the idea is that everything people do is fundamentally rational to maximize that personal gain. The three main assumptions for this theory is that there is completeness, so that means that every action can be ranked, and so you can find the value of it. Also that there's transitivity, since A is preferable to B and B is preferable to C. You may remember this from, I think, geometry before, but therefore A would be preferable to C. And then also that there is an independence of irrelevant alternatives. So if you have a fourth option from the A, B, and C that we mentioned before, it won't really change how the ranking was for the other three options. It would just add another place within this ranking system. So that's a rational choice theory. And then the exchange theory is that people calculate the costs and benefits of each action and choose the one with the best outcome for themselves. And this is mostly noticed through reward and punishment. So exchange theory is usually used to study family relationships, work relationships, partner selection, parenting, and also more. But the main thing is that people seek to rationally maximize their profits, and they want to continue doing behavior that results in more reward as opposed to punishment. And also there's the idea, because it relates with the costs and benefits, it also relates with supply and demand in terms that when a reward is more available, then people will also see that as being less valuable. And so, right, people want to maximize that benefit from the cost, but they also want to gain that maximum personal gain from the rational choice theory. So both of these are in a way related because it's a similar idea to maximize the good. And so from here, we're going to go into our first question. So we have here 100% saying choice D. I'm very happy about that. So right here, we have the answer is choice D. So the question asks, I'm just going to briefly go over it because I think most of you guys got it, but in case there are any questions about it. So the question asks, which of these is considered a research question viewed from a microsociology perspective? And so we want to look at something affecting a small scale perspective. So for choice A, it says, how does the patenting of seeds for various crops by large businesses cause a conflict between local farmers and the agribusiness? So we see here that the agribusiness is a really big, large scale type of business. So that already kind of would be like a macro sociology idea. And then with choice B, it says, how does the conflict between Republicans and Democrats in Congress affect the US? And like similar to choice A, the US as a whole, that's on a more macro sociology perspective, as opposed to looking at those small scale interactions between people. And then for choice C, it says, what impacts does having an alternate view of medicine have on the expectations of care provided? And so this is just care in general provided by the healthcare system. And so that is another like large scale thing, which is why choice D is the correct answer, because it mentions like what role do people who identify themselves as local community members play in their community? And so it's their interactions, their individual interactions with their community themselves, which is on a smaller scale view. So now we're going to also go into another question. So we have 100% saying choice A, which is also awesome because yes, the answer is A. So you guys got it, like 100% of you guys got it, which is awesome. So just to briefly go over this one, it says, in a nearby town, a student was speaking with a friend, and the friend believes that the reasons for the increasing number of strikes by workers in the nearby factory is due to the inequalities that workers have realized between them and upper management. Furthermore, that this inequality that the upper class maintains oppresses the lower class. Which sociology theory best explains this friend's thought? So definitely, because we're noticing here that it's regarding the inequalities between, in this case, workers and upper management. That one definitely relates to the conflict theory, which is all about like the inequalities between different classes. Functionalism more focuses on these, what contributes to the stability of a society, and is also on a macro sociology perspective. Symbolic interaction is more on a, both symbolic interaction and rational exchange theory are both on a minor, like a micro sociology perspective that focuses on those like individual interactions that each person has with each other. So in this case, it's more of like the groups of these, you know, workers and the group of the upper management, as opposed to like them interacting with each other, which is why choice A is the correct answer. And just so you know, for the most part, the MCAT will focus on the theories that I mentioned in this PowerPoint slide. If you see, I guess those are the ones that are most popularly tested on. So I would say really know these well, and also really know the people who developed these theories, because sometimes they also might refer to them as like, or they might ask a question where they kind of give a situation and they ask, oh, you know, what would Durkheim, or what would the theory associated with Durkheim kind of lead to a conclusion for? And so then, you know, you would have to answer it that way sometimes. And then other times they just give you situations like this and try to ask you, you know, which theory best explains this.